and many of the Gentiles. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct to this day.
In a court of law, the rebuttal case is an opportunity for the other side to present their evidence. Well, in recent years, there's been a proliferation of books and articles about the so-called Gnostic Gospels. And I wanted to figure out, does this represent the mainstream of academic scholarship?
The Gnostic Gospels are a collection of religious writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They blend the teachings of Jesus with a variety of ancient philosophical beliefs. According to the tenets of Gnosticism, the universe was the creation of a flawed and wicked God. Therefore, all matter was evil. Salvation from this world could only be attained through secret knowledge about the spiritual nature of man.
There's been a lot of talk about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. These documents are almost universally recognized to be much later than the New Testament Gospels and not to record historically reliable material related to Jesus.
Well, the New Testament Gospels give us a portrait of an early 1st century Palestinian Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels from the 2nd century, which are mostly Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Mary, they give us a very different Jesus. Now, you can pick and choose if you want. You can say, well, I like the 2nd century Gnostic Jesus better. Others might want the early 1st century Palestinian Jesus. But if you're going to be a scholar about it, and you're going to talk about, well, which Gospels really do give us earlier traditions that more reliably reflect the actual historical Jesus, you got to go with the New Testament Gospels every time.
There's a view among some that there were all of these different competing views of Jesus Christ, and that the one that won out became the orthodox perspective of Christ reflected in the Gospels. All the evidence runs contrary to that. Jesus was a 1st century Jewish teacher who revealed and demonstrated himself to be the Messiah. That's the presentation we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the New Testament Gospels. These later Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, present a very different Jesus, almost a Greek philosopher, an esoteric Gnostic Jesus. It's clearly not the authentic historical Jesus.
What I've come to discover is that the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our best sources for Jesus. And I've also found that they are reliable, and that from these sources we can form a picture that I believe is very accurate, that tells us about Jesus, what he taught, how he was perceived by his contemporaries, and what his life was really all about.
Everything from Jesus' parables to his healings, to his controversies, to his warnings, and all of that, the reason they were telling this stuff is that not just it was good advice for them in their own day, but that it actually mattered, that it actually happened. And if it hadn't happened, you're into a totally different worldview, a worldview which is about ideas, which is about self-realization, hugely popular in our culture just now, discovering who I really am. You know, for goodness sake, Jesus didn't come to help me discover who I really am. He came to tell me who he knew I really was and to do something about it. And that's much better news.
After a while, as the evidence would accumulate more and more, it was like there were these scales and they began to tip increasingly. And I began to go from a hard-hearted, cynical atheist to someone who was still skeptical, but who was more open-minded, maybe more of a spiritual seeker, someone who was willing to follow the evidence wherever it took me. This whole time I was on this investigative journey, Leslie and her friends behind the scenes were praying because they knew that I was checking into the evidence. I was looking into these issues for myself, and they just wanted me to be open-minded about the evidence that I found.
I was feeling like my whole world was opening up into something new and way more exciting and fulfilling than what we had been on. And it was that frustration of trying to help him to recognize that that was the case.
Well, Leslie tried several things during this period to try to spur me on in my investigation. It didn't help very much. For instance, she would leave Bible tracts around the house, or she would take a Christian book and highlight certain passages and leave it open on a coffee table, things like that. And it really didn't help. And I told her it was not helping, and she understood that. But I think sort of the whole time she was holding her breath, because this was not a very smooth investigation.
He would take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Sometimes it looked like he was really getting it, and other times he would just turn into an angry, frustrated person again. And so it was a very frustrating time for both of us.
I believe Jesus was a real person. I believe he did live. I guess there are some exaggerations in the Bible, I'd have to say.
I don't believe we'll ever know if Jesus was really what everyone thinks he is. I think it's a lot of folklore. I think it's a lot of historical misrepresentations. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. But I don't think we know, and I don't think we'll ever know, and I don't think there's any way to prove what has been claimed about Jesus for all these years.
The biographies of Jesus in the New Testament gave me a lot of information about him. But Christians were saying that he is the Son of God. That's a huge step to take to believe that. And so I sought out more scholars so I could pose to them this question: who was Jesus?
Michael Rydelnik, Moody Bible Institute. Ben Witherington, Asbury Seminary.
Now, this is one of the things I love about Jesus, and it says something to us. His identity is complex. He can't be pigeonholed. He fits no one formula. There's a lot of aspects to who he is. But always, he presents himself as a challenge to the status quo, to preconditioned thinking about what Son of God, what Messiah must be. He's carving out his own niche. He's doing his own thing like a great and creative artist. He is not simply replicating anything from the past. He is taking bits and pieces of prophecies and ideas and wisdom literature and law and you name it, and he's made a whole new gumbo. And he's serving it up, and people don't know what to think. He goes in a synagogue and says some of this stuff, and they go, wow, a new teaching, and with authority. Shazam!
Amazingly, people say, no one teaches like him because he spoke with his own authority. Our sages, our rabbis, always taught that you have to teach in the name of someone else. Rabbi so-and-so says in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. That's the way rabbis were taught to teach. Yeshua came and said, you've heard it said, but not what my rabbi taught me, but I say unto you.
And he would clarify, even overrule in some ways, the Old Testament law. Well, this law was given by God himself, for Jesus to say, I am the authoritative interpreter of the law. I am the one who has come to fulfill the law. That's an extraordinary claim, a claim to essentially the authority of God.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives. Isaiah 61:1.
It's interesting because when Yeshua went into the synagogue, that was the passage he read. And he says, this day, this verse is fulfilled in your hearing. And basically he's saying, I'm the servant that's described here. I'm the one who fulfills this.
Philip comes to Jesus and asks him to show us the Father, and Jesus says, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus clearly presents himself as the self-revelation of God. Those who meet Jesus are, in fact, meeting God.
When Jesus is brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and some of the Sanhedrin members that have gathered the evening that Jesus is arrested, they're trying to find incriminating evidence, they're trying to find incriminating testimony, and they're not doing real well. And finally, the high priest asked Jesus directly, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand, coming with the clouds of heaven. And there Jesus has combined phrases from Daniel 7 and Psalm 110.